Hello and welcome to APTN National News this wonderful Wednesday evening. I'm Sav Jonesa. Yesterday, Prime Minister Mark Carney addressed the Assembly of First Nations in Ottawa. His remarks followed the unanimous passing of an emergency resolution to support coastal First Nations. They have rejected the idea of a pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia's coast. Our reporter Savannah Craig looks at how Carney was received at the AFN following discontent over the potential pipeline.
As if First Nations rights can be wiped away with one federal-provincial MOU.
National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nipenak is talking about the Memorandum of Understanding signed between the federal government and Alberta. The MOU endorses constructing a new bitumen pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia's coast.
It was difficult to watch BC and many First Nations excluded from these discussions, particularly on the Pacific coast.
The issue was the top topic of discussion on the first day of the Special Chiefs Assembly in Ottawa, resulting in an emergency draft resolution.
Affirming the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act and supporting coastal First Nations rejection of any proposed pipeline from Alberta to BC's northwest coast.
Part of the resolution calls for an immediate withdrawal of the MOU. Last week, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith welcomed partners in Indigenous communities that attended the signing of the MOU.
Chief Jim Boucher of the Mackay First Nation, Chris Sankey, former councillor of Laxqualam Band in British Columbia, Dave Lamouche, president of Métis Settlements General Council.
She's referring to a handful of First Nations leaders in Alberta.
I know there's a number of First Nations in Alberta that are supportive.
There was no regional Alberta representative in attendance of the Special Chiefs meeting. The role has remained vacant since 2021.
For the most part, in British Columbia, it's a resounding no.
British Columbia Regional Chief Terry Teegee says the resolution that passed sends a strong message to governments.
The answer is no for many British Columbia First Nations who are concerned about the north coast of British Columbia, but also along the route as well. There are many concerns. You know, much of what was discussed during the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline discussions are still relevant today, and most First Nations haven't changed their mind.
Must see, thank you for allowing us to be here.
TG raised his concerns to Prime Minister Mark Carney when he addressed the Assembly of First Nations Tuesday afternoon.
And what concrete measures will your government implement to ensure that First Nations have true decision-making authority as stated in the United Nations Declaration Act, including free, prior, and informed consent on all major projects that impact our lands, waters, and rights?
Prime Minister Carney insists the MOU does not overlook free, prior, and informed consent.
I'll say one last thing, if I may, about the MOU with Alberta, between the federal government and Alberta. It is about a large number of things that are with respect to Alberta. What they are going to do with nuclear power, if anything, what they're going to do with artificial intelligence. If any of those issues, and many of them do, touch Treaty 6, 7, 8 rights holders, other rights holders in Alberta, of course, that consultation has to happen. There we are.
The Prime Minister says his office has reached out to request a meeting with the leadership of the coastal First Nations to further discuss the issue. Savannah Craig, APTN National News, Ottawa.
The Assembly of First Nations winter meeting in Ottawa continued on Wednesday with discussions on clean water legislation and long-term reform in the First Nations child welfare. As Fraser Needham reports, the day began with several Ontario chiefs holding a press conference on Parliament Hill.
Speaking at the presser on Wednesday morning, Anishinaabe Nation Grand Council Chief Linda DeBossi said it remains unclear what a First Nations Clean Water Act will look like whenever it gets reintroduced. The Clean Water Act, called Bill C-61, was introduced in 2023, but it was never passed because an election was called last January. Chief DeBossi claimed reintroducing the legislation is not a priority for the Carney government.
But as far as assurances, we don't have any. You know, we saw the speed and efficiency to which C5 went through Parliament, no questions asked. It sped through committee, it sped through Senate, it received royal assent. C61 has already been through first and second reading. It's been to committee. It was set up for third reading to go to Senate.
First Nations are now worried whatever water legislation is drafted will be seriously compromised. In Canada, First Nation Chief Gary Queesis' community has been under a boil water advisory for 30 years. He challenged Prime Minister Mark Carney on that at the Assembly on Tuesday afternoon. At Wednesday's press conference, he said he was not satisfied with the answer he received.
I kind of felt I didn't get anywhere with my voice from the Prime Minister. I didn't get a clear answer, and I know there's a lot of words that have been said, but there's no action plan. You know, when the day is it going to start?
As well, National Children's Chiefs Commission Chair Pauline Frost and Family Caring Society Executive Director Cindy Blackstock presented on long-term reform on First Nations child welfare and Jordan's Principle in the afternoon. Frost said the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has imposed a looming deadline at the end of this month for Canada and the NCC to come up with a framework on long-term reform on child welfare. But she said for the past year the federal government has been uncooperative.
That means Canada needs to be at the table. Canada needs to find a solution with us. They cannot move without us.
Word came out late Wednesday afternoon that Prime Minister Mark Carney was meeting with Alberta chiefs from Treaties 6, 7, and 8. We'll have more on that later. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
The Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations has released its analysis of the 2025 federal budget. From health to education, the analysis gives an overview that says, despite dollars being announced for this year, multi-year funding is a must. The analysis highlights areas for growth to ensure First Nations are not left without support. In the analysis, FSIN Chief Bobby Cameron said there is no Canada Strong without First Nations Strong. The analysis notes funding for Jordan's Principle, K-12 education, emergency management, non-insured health benefits, and negotiation support requires multi-year commitments with carry-forward policies to prevent service disruptions. It also points out the difficulty of translating national funding totals into local community impact. The conclusion is that the 2025 budget commitments could strengthen Canada's economy and First Nations self-determination if talks between the two parties remain transparent and equitable. What started as a peaceful rally in Victoria, British Columbia, erupted into all-out chaos as residential school survivors, supporters, and students confronted members of the One BC Party who deny traumatic experiences ever happened at residential schools. APTN's Tina House was there and brings us this story.
Close to 1,000 people gathered under the Every Child Matters flag at the University of Victoria, where One BC MLA Dallas Brody and her supporters were trying to hold a speaking event. Brody says residential school trauma never happened, and there are no unmarked graves. Her views and word of her event triggered a huge response. A sea of residential school survivors and their supporters showed up to make sure they were here to stop it from happening.
I am the great-granddaughter. I am the granddaughter. I am the child of the Indian you couldn't remove. My people were torn from their families, torn from mothers. And what I can't comprehend is how our survivors are finally being recognized.
Rye Morin gathered statements from survivors for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He's one of the organizers of today's anti-rally.
All those people have to do is open their hearts and minds to listen to survivors. All they have to do is just open their ears for 5 brief minutes and they would know that there is no reason why anybody would ever make up the stories that have been shared about what Canada and the churches have done in this country.
And for Steve Sweethall, his whole family attended residential school and the pain is still evident.
And we're separated. You know, I tried to run away. It was a very lonely time, and people have to understand. I think people today's, even our own people, need to understand what that was like for their parents, their grandfathers and grandmothers. So I think it's important that not to relive the pain and open up those wounds, but to just keep educating as much as we can, so we don't have these kind of groups that are forming politically to damage what the truth really is.
And just steps away from the event, Dallas Brody and her supporters, including Frances Widdowson, showed up despite not being allowed onto campus by officials. According to 1BC, Widdowson was arrested for trespassing, but later released.
Yes, she was arrested for doing nothing, for coming to have conversations.
We caught up with 1BC Party Chief of Staff Tim Thielman. He was just outside of the rally, and that's when it turned into chaos.
This guy's gonna throw a fucking flashbang right there. You retard, right there. Okay. Right there.
2.5
right
years
there.
to be doing this.
Get smashed. What? You
Are you saying that all the residential school survivors are lying? I'm saying that there is no evidence that there was 215 children murdered in Kamloops, and anybody that says there is lying. It doesn't matter what color you are, it doesn't matter who your ancestors are. We have a society that has to be based on truth. That we require evidence for claims.
Ironically, Thielman was then engulfed in orange smoke. Party supporter Jim McMurtry is a former school teacher. He was fired over comments that he made denying residential school trauma ever happened, and he was prevented from speaking at the event. The 1BC Party supporters refused to leave, and in the end, they were escorted off campus by police. Tina House, APTN National News, Victoria.
Thanks for that, Tina. Fans of the cult classic show North of 60 can revisit its tales from a modern perspective thanks to a new podcast. We'll tell you more about that after the break. Welcome back. Negotiations between Iqaluit Housing Authority and unionized workers for a new contract is still ongoing. The last update from Nunavut Employees Union, which represents the workers, says negotiation teams were able to reach agreement on some items but not others. Our Justin Hardy has more from Iqaluit.
The union posted on social media this week that the parties were able to negotiate improvements related to standby, language bonus, family abuse leave, and professional development, among other items. But the NEU and Iqaluit Housing Authority were not able to agree on wages and allowances. The union is asking for significant increases to the various allowances like settlement, housing, utilities, and more. NEU says many of these allowances have not been increased in many years, and not all members are entitled to them, but should be. The union is also seeking wage increases in parity with the government's last round of increases, along with the removal of concessions. Nunavut Housing Corporation, under which the Iqaluit Housing Authority was formed, is not commenting. Justin Hardy, APTN National News, Iqaluit.
Musicians, artists, and a few chefs will soon be joining together for a full day of music, food, and prizes. They're pooling their talents and generosity to help a small area in Jamaica. Here's Annette Francis with that story.
Tyendinaga Mohawk musician David Miracle is taking on a generous task. Miracle and a group of friends are helping the community of St. Margaret in Jamaica after Hurricane Melissa left nothing but carnage.
I was just there doing a concert a couple months ago, and the people were so beautiful, the food was great, and I leave making new friends. I leave the country and I get home, and 2 months passes and the devastation hits with the storm. I guess her name was Melissa that came in. And she came in and she blew through and left a lot of damage there, so our hearts went out.
Allison Scott lives in Kingston, Ontario, but Jamaica is her original home. She still has family and friends living there. She says the place where Miracle played a few months ago is now housing women and children who've been left with nothing.
So this is where we feel called to support these women and children into getting back into their homes. And St. Elizabeth, for example, is called the bread and basket of Jamaica. It provides food for the rest of the country, basically. So what we want to do is support the farmers in getting back into sustaining themselves.
According to Miracle, the One Love fundraiser for Jamaica will be held on December 21st, and it's coming together nicely.
We put out a bulletin of our concert, and we talked a little bit about having an auction, a silent auction, and to our surprise, it wasn't really a big surprise. Everybody stepped up to the plate, and their hearts opened up again, and they said, yes, we'd love to be a part of what you're doing, and the paintings started coming in.
The event will be hosted by Marianne Maroney and Richard Crook here at their residence in Desiranto, the restored church that offers a 300-seat stage located just east of Tyendinaga.
It's just been incredible, the outpouring of all the artists that have come together. The lineup is sensational, and Richard and I just really feel that this was at one point a church in the community, and now it's a community gathering place for everybody, not one denomination, but for all denominations, for all peoples. And so it's just a little bit of a bridge and an opportunity for the community to come together.
Miracle says people are still donating to the silent auction, and more musicians are coming on board.
I just called up Derek Miller, and he's 100% in. He was excited. 2-time Juno Award winner. He also played in the Rumble.
The event will take place from 2 to 9 p.m. on December 21st. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Desiranto, Ontario.
A new podcast launched on Tuesday that's born from friendship and a shared love of an iconic 90s television show. Our reporter Charlotte Mort-Jacobs sits down with the producers who are taking listeners back to the fictional community of Lynx River, Northwest Territories, and exploring topics that are still relevant today.
If you recognize this catchy jingle, you're not alone. For Brie O'Keefe and Mila Nekiko, what started as a nostalgic rewatch quickly became a deeper endeavor. They've launched Lynx River Revisited, a podcast which explores the legacy of North of 60, its accuracy and relevance. Both hosts have a deep connection to Lillekwan, Fort Simpson, the NWT community Lynx River is based on.
My dad was the chief of Lillekwan for quite a while. And at one point he had a band manager who was from southern BC. And like through the everyday events that go on in the band office and like in the community, he was like, one day he was just like, this would make a really good TV show. I was pretty young, but we would get writers from the show coming up to visit my dad, and they would like hang out and we would have cookouts and they would be there.
Their personal histories and unique insight add to their analysis.
It makes sense, like when you see him and his friends hanging out on the church steps. Would kids do that in Fort Simpson?
I've hung out on church steps in Fort Simpson, yes.
But one of the like interesting tensions of the show was my dad was in Fort Simpson to be the senior administrative officer, who's kind of the top civil servant for the municipality or the village, and really what I think of now as a colonial governance institution. And Mila's dad was a former chief of Lillekwan First Nation and an MLA, but really pushing boundaries in terms of Indigenous self-governance. I do feel like we're the children of two different sides of a community in the north, and it's been great to talk about that.
Yeah.
CBC's North of 60 aired between 1992 and 1999 and resurged on APTN in 2018, thanks to its critical acclaim amongst fans. Largely unseen in mainstream media, the series provided a window into everyday life in a First Nation community.
What kept us interested beyond just the nostalgia is the topics they're talking about in that show are still the topics that are challenging Indigenous communities today in a way that you wouldn't realize 30 years have passed. And there's been so much progress made, but it still feels very, very current, the issues it's addressing.
The podcast is more than just a look back. It's an evolving conversation, bridging past, present, and future with special guests and experts.
We can continue keeping the show going. We're hoping to spend some time in Fort Simpson using the studio at the band office, because they have a really nice facility there. So like hopefully we could do there and like have guests from the community on the show.
Lynx River Revisited episodes will be launched every Tuesday starting December 2nd on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
One last break now. We'll see you in just a couple minutes. Tomorrow it will be 0 in St. John's and 3 in Charlottetown. It will be -5 in Cartwright and -10 in Kuujjuaq. 0 in Montreal and -13 in Val-d'Or. -3 in Toronto, -9 in Sault Ste. Marie. Sioux Lookout is a sunny -13 and -14 in Timmins. Lots of sun in Manitoba, -23 in Churchill tomorrow, -14 in God's Lake. -5 in Winnipeg, and it will be -4 in Dauphin. -2 in Regina, -3 in North Battleford. -17 in Stony Rapids, and -8 in Buffalo Narrows. -11 in High Level in Fort Chipewyan. It will be 1 in Edmonton, Red Deer, and Calgary. 5 in Vancouver and 1 in Bella Coola. -9 in Fort Nelson and 4 in Smithers. -1 in snow in Whitehorse, -32 in Old Crow. -16 in Yellowknife, -19 in Norman Wells, lots of sun there. The sun continues, -23 in Sax Harbor, and it will be -19 in Tuktoyaktuk. -24 in Chesterfield, -29 in Cambridge Bay. It will be a sunny 11, -11 in Iqaluit, and -20 in Resolute. Flags were raised at the Canada Games Centre in Whitehorse on Tuesday in the lead up to the 2026 Arctic Winter Games. Flags from all 8 competing contingents, including Nunavut, Alaska, and Greenland, were raised alongside the host municipality's flag. Flags for 2 Whitehorse host First Nations, the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and the Tonquachin Council, were also raised. The biannual event attracts young athletes from across the circumpolar north while celebrating their distinct Indigenous cultures. The 2020 Games were scheduled to take place in Whitehorse, but were canceled due to the COVID pandemic. With less than 100 days to go, the city's host society says it's eager to welcome Northern athletes back to Whitehorse.
These flags represent the athletes and teams that are coming here from the circumpolar north, the cultural diversity of everyone who will be attending, and Northern unity, which is basically defines what the Arctic Winter Games are.
The Games will take place March 8th to the 15th. And with that, we've reached the end of our newscast for today. We'll be back here again at 1 p.m. Eastern tomorrow to give you the latest news from across Turtle Island. But until then, I'm Sav Jonesa, and from all of us here at APTN, thank you so much for joining us and take care.